The 15-minute city, 20-minute city, the walkable city, many different names to refer to a growing trend in urban areas centered around the need for proximity, community, and good quality of life. In walkable cities, one can go from work to the gym, to the bar, to the shop in less than, you guessed it, 15 minutes, using a combination of public transportation and walking. 16 cities in the world have committed to implement this idea, and I'm currently in one of them, Paris. The mayor, Anne Hidalgo, has invested in making the city more bike-friendly. Parking spots are progressively turning into green areas, playgrounds, neighborhood meetup points, or bike parking spots. This project is part of a more general movement, seeking not only to imagine, but also to create the city of the future. But it isn't new. In the 1920s, American urban planner Clarence Perry also introduced the idea of the livable neighborhood unit, before the mass influx of private cars and city zoning arrived later in the 20th century. Copenhagen pedestrianized its main shopping street in 1962, before other densely built European cities used it as an inspiration to build their own downtown areas. Then we have new urbanism, an urban design movement promoting walkable cities that swept across the US in the 1980s. All these movements have one thing in common: they seek to reduce the use of cars. Today's discussions on the walkable city draw from that tradition, as well as the growing popularity of the imaginary world of solarpunk. This is what solarpunk looks like. So it seeks to break the hierarchies between humans and the living to favor sort of symbiosis, a collaboration between the two. On paper, the 15-minute city sounds like a great idea, almost a necessity given our planet's poor health. But there is no consensus around it. Many criticize it for being a sort of urban liberal fantasy. Others argue that it leads to new forms of segregations. And some, like Jordan B. Peterson, go as far as saying that it is a tyrannical bureaucrat idea, part of a, quote, well-documented plan, a global scheme, others add, to control us all. So in this video, I want to look at all the criticism from the perspective of someone who likes the idea and wanted to do the extra research to see what its potential is, what's truly behind the 15-minute city, and why some are strongly opposed to it.
What is a 15-minute city?
What if we could create a new normal, where we reclaim our time, our health and well-being?
15-minute city revolves around three basic principles.
The World Economic Forum is really pushing for this.
Let's start with the light criticism before we move on to the conspiracy theories. The most obvious one is the segregation. By segregation, we mean that people from the same economic backgrounds, with the same ideas, the same ethnicity, end up in the same places, and so that we have this sort of patchwork of rich and poor neighborhoods that do not interact with each other. This is more or less what already exists in big cities today. The rich often live outside of the center or in specific areas in the center, in gated communities. On the other hand, the low-income communities are packed in ghettos in which air pollution is high, in which inhabitants have long commutes, and in which the lack of investment in public structures is compensated by police control. If it doesn't take into account those inequalities, the 15-minute city will only increase them. It will remain an urban liberal fantasy. One obvious solution to that would be to favor class diversity in the different neighborhoods of the city to achieve the so-called melting pot, a metaphor used by 20th century playwright Israel Zangwill. On the poster of the play that you see on screen, we see that behind the melting pot is the idea of merging all our differences to create something cohesive, a sort of universal identity. In that case, it means being American. Now, the concept of universalism very much resonates with my country, France. As I've talked about in past videos, France has always encouraged and sometimes forced assimilation, meaning the cancellation of one's cultural differences to adopt the French language, culture, and lifestyle. That is why I believe we need to be cautious when we talk about promoting class or ethnic diversity in neighborhoods. It is first important that we don't treat diverse low-income families as guinea pigs by randomly throwing them in council housing in primarily white neighborhoods and see what happens. We also have to make sure we don't force assimilation, the cancelling of cultural differences to the benefit of the dominant cultural group, but rather promote Integration, meaning the coexistence of cultural differences within a given community. The idea of coexistence was theorized by French and Senegalese writer and poet Léopold Sédar Senghor, who wanted to highlight the specificity of the Black African identity and culture, but also allow a certain degree of mixing with other cultures. He believed that the dialogue, not the amalgamation, not the melting pot, but the dialogue between different cultures was immensely beneficial for humanity. To put it simply, we can learn so much from each other if we choose to see our cultures as equally valuable. We can apply Senghor's ideas to the 15-minute city, a place where such a dialogue can exist. In fact, it is precisely in Paris in the 1920s, 1930s, in places like the Latin Quarter, that intellectual expats coming from what was called the Third World met with each other and also with French Republicans to talk politics, diplomacy, the fight against imperialism, etc., etc. They truly inspired each other. So that's one thing. Another common criticism addressed to the 15-minute city or village city is that it gets boring after a while. I mean, one of the reasons why people have moved to big cities since the Industrial Revolution is to escape the village, the rumors that stretch from one generation to the next, the conservatism of small villages. I mean, you have a bunch of novels dealing with those topics, especially American urban novels written in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I'm a big fan of those, so let me get some for you. I was convinced it was Sister Carrie by Dreiser, but no, it's an old edition of Waynesburg, Ohio, one of my favorite books that is precisely about this sort of village mentality. The rumors and all the secrets, you know. But yeah, I was thinking about Sister Carrie by Dreiser and also Black Boy by Richard Wright. Sister Carrie and this book are precisely about this desire to escape village mentality, to move to the big city where everything seems possible. I love these books because I deeply resonate with the message, you know. I also grew up in a conservative village. When I was writing the script, I had this Kygo song in my head. It's a song I've always listened to. It says, all of my friends are settling down, they're only kids but they're married now, let's follow the light, follow the crowd, baby we gotta get out, let's get out of this town. That was my anthem as a teen. But yeah, villages can feel like a prison, especially when you resonate with what is beyond the village. I'm so glad I taught myself English outside of school because it opened a world of knowledge, a world of possibility, outside the village, outside French Flanders, where I grew up. And well, let's be honest, most people are racist, misogynistic, homophobic. It reassured me to see that what was going on in the village, what people said or thought, was not the norm. Given what I've said, how can we create a walkable city, villages within a city, without reproducing those harmful dynamics? Well, we more or less answered that question with the previous criticism, to which we responded that we need to bring diversity in neighborhoods, ethnic, generational, class diversity. Having people with various backgrounds gathered in one neighborhood will make life so much more exciting than having the same exact people, the same exact families who've known each other for generations. And that variety of people, of life experiences, can also be a great source of innovation and creativity, since everybody brings something different to the table. It's also important to remind ourselves that in a walkable city, the network of public transportation allows for greater movement within and outside the village. Now, it is true that when we think about freedom, the freedom to move, we tend to think about the car. The advertising industry is responsible for creating this connection in our head. The car is a symbol of freedom, liberation. You know, I felt so free when I got my driving license because in the countryside, you can't do anything if you don't have a car. We must change that subconscious connection. The car is nothing else than a means of transportation. It fulfills a need to move from one place to another, a need that other modes of transportation can fulfill at cheaper cost, at greater speeds, at lower risks. We don't need cars, we need flexible means of transportation. You know what time it is now. It is time to debunk the conspiracy theory, or at least uncover its ideological components. Okay, so why are conservatives, Tories, and conspiracy theorists claiming that walkable cities are a dystopian socialist disaster? A tool of control. Control is a word that came back pretty often. Well, they are right in a way. It is true that the most common historical representations of villages we have is the kingdom, with the almighty king and its subjects. The king exerted control over his subjects, collected taxes and protected them against the enemy in exchange for that. But that wasn't socialism, that was feudalism, so we need to find another example. Well, an experimentation of the walkable city, the village, that has the aesthetic of socialism might be the manual worker cities in the east of France, more precisely in the city of Mulhouse, which is basically what Elon Musk's utopian town in Texas is like. The problem with those cities is that they reinforce management control over the workers by forcing them to settle down in a house surrounded by other individual houses close to work, but also by orienting their activities outside of work. Finally, another project that gets to be called socialist was the Familistère in the 19th century in the north of France. The Familistère was also a manual worker city, as you can see on those images. It was created by Godin, an entrepreneur with socialist values who wanted to make his business flourish, but also wanted to provide a good quality of life to his employees. He refused to give workers individual houses like the cities in Mulhouse to favor instead proximity and cooperation. In all honesty, he really seemed like a great guy, conscious about the well-being of workers, but ultimately, he was the one in control. He was the one getting richer and richer every year thanks to his workers. So when conservatives criticize the 15-minute city, they point at the sort of bureaucratic control the king or the business owner exerted over its subjects or workers, and that's fair criticism. That is something that advocates of walkable cities have to take into consideration. It is possible to avoid the top-down feudal or socialist approach of the walkable city. If that is possible, why are conservatives strictly opposed to the project? Well, we know that statistically, conservatives tend to live outside urban centers, in the suburbs, in the countryside. And one characteristic of suburbs, especially American suburbs, is isolation. The US was built around the myth of conquest, expansion, and private property. It is reflected in Americans' dependency on the car. By the mid-1930s, there was one registered automobile for every 2 US households, while car ownership in Europe was mostly limited to wealthy elites. In the 1950s, the US federal government offered a 90% match to build the interstate highway system that soon crisscrossed most US urban areas. This new era of urban development was called urban renewal. I worked on it for my first-year master thesis, and in that thesis, I showed how urban renewal impacted low-income communities, especially black communities, because it simply displaced them and wished them the best. In the same manner they displaced Native Americans. Urban renewal was part of the US expansionist tradition. The highways allowed white middle classes to settle in the suburbs, in their private homes with their private garden and their private cars. Those who reject the 15-minute city today are the same type of people who advocated for the development of suburbs back in the 1950s. They are people who deeply value private property, the ideal of the nuclear family like we see in 1950s, 1960s TV ads, with the head of the household, almost systematically the dad, the forever smiling wife, and the well-behaved kids. At that time, that sort of lifestyle that we Europeans call the American way of life meant freedom. Freedom from urban sprawl and bureaucracy. But freedom for who? In fact, in the 1950s, the feminist movement started to show that the American dream of the suburban home and nuclear family was a lie. One book in particular really shook the foundations of that ideal. The book is titled The Feminine Mystique, and it was written by Betty Friedan. Partly based on interviews of housewives, it challenged the belief that women naturally found fulfillment in their role as housewives' mothers. The structure of the suburb made it so that women felt isolated from the world. Even if today a majority of women also work, those who live in suburbs still undergo the consequences of living in an isolated home. In an article published in Women's Health magazine, a team of researchers found that women in small, rural and isolated areas reported the highest prevalence of intimate partner violence. We're talking about 22.5% and 17.9% respectively, compared to 50.5% for urban women. Rural women reported significantly higher severity of physical abuse than their urban counterparts. And finally, the mean distance to the nearest IPV resource was 3 times greater for rural women than for urban women. Sure, domestic violence happens in many different ways, no matter the gender, no matter the sexuality, but the domestic violence perpetrated by men and targeting women is significantly more common. So it is certainly true that the suburbs are located away from bureaucratic control, but the control is very likely to be transferred onto the head of the household, the dad. So when I hear conservatives complain about losing their freedom over idealist projects like the walkable city, what I hear is their fear to lose the control they have as masters of the household. What the 15-minute city offers is not control, but cooperation between inhabitants. The ability to exchange, to learn from each other, to partake in activities that will get us out of the home, the ability to meet with friends, to make new friends, to talk about our problems, to get access to public services. It's a structure that favors direct democracy, and sure, we can improve it in many ways. Sure, the future of cities is so much more than the 15-minute city debate, but the ideas this concept brings to the table, the discussions and fizz it creates, is truly what makes it interesting to consider. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, the conversation continues in the comments section. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, if it's not already done. I would like to thank my patrons for their support, and a special thank to top-tier Patreons. Jason Ferguson, Rémi, Trébizon, Toki, Corrigi, Tristan, Patricia, Christopher, Ian, Donage, Alex, Ren, Benjamin, Edwin, Sam, Manuel, Dakota, Jay, Sam, Perry, and Carla. And yeah, other than that, I'll see you very soon. Salut!